Hi, hello, hello.
Hello.
Oh God, are you British?
Yeah, I am British. I live in America though, if that counts for anything.
No, it doesn't. But
Okay, my
if
apologies.
anything, it's even worse because you're basically invading my country. But
Well, I don't know what to tell you.
no, it's okay. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to apologize for your existence. It's all good.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
hey, how's it
thanks.
going?
That's very nice of you.
Yeah,
Hey,
doing.
it's going pretty good. Nice to meet you, Stephen, Destiny.
Yep. Nice to meet you, dude. Do you want to introduce yourself and all that?
Yeah, I don't know to what extent you'd like me to go in terms of detail. I'm a professional psychedelic researcher. I'm somewhat known in niche online psychedelic drug nerd communities. I originally founded a website called PsychonautWiki, which, for clarification, I'm not involved in anymore and left a number of years ago. I now work full time for a biotech research company, and I focus on a kind of field or community movement that I've started called subjective effect documentation, where I formally document and classify altered states of consciousness into individual subjective effects with formalized details and leveling systems. And there's a whole replication community around it that handle replicating the visual and auditory side of it. But there's a lot. I think that's about it.
Okay, geez. All right. Well, what do you want to talk about?
Um, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I originally started watching your stream somewhat regularly when it was brought to my attention that you were looking at PsychonautWiki after the methamphetamine saga.
Oh yeah,
And
I think I went to your site or went to the site that you founded to see if I was going to die or not when I was in the Netherlands, Amsterdam.
yeah, did you ever come to any conclusion?
Yeah, I survived, so
Um,
I guess not dead.
I mean, in terms of what substance it was, I had a look for a bunch of different research chemical stimulants, and I honestly couldn't find anything that fit the duration criteria of what you were describing,
Yeah, I
which is a
couldn't
little
either.
odd.
It was hard actually because it seemed like nothing adequately captured it. So I don't know if it was an artist. I had a few people. I had one guy email me some huge thing about all sorts of different amphetamines, but yeah, I have no idea. All I know is whatever I took, it was a 200 milligram capsule of some shaved off crystal thing, and it probably kept us high for around, I want to say 16-ish hours, and then awake for some time after that. But
Well, that could have been methamphetamine, but typically the duration isn't quite that long. Were you were you still fully stimulated at that point, as in the effects were still going, or you were still feeling lingering effects from after the peak?
so it's hard to tell because after about 12 hours, I started to get a little nervous. And then, like, at 14, 15 hours, I started to get pretty concerned. So it's hard to tell what the mental effects are when I'm under, like, duress. Like, for instance,
Yeah.
if I have, so sometimes when I smoke weed, because of prior mushroom trips, I'll get like a panic attack. And if I smoke weed and I start to get really high and I get a panic attack, I'll sober up very quickly. But I'm probably not actually sobering up. I'm probably still high, but it's like the fear of the panic attack has kind of like gotten me out of that like high mental state. So if you were to ask me, I'd say like, oh yeah, having a panic attack like makes me sober instantly. But that's probably not what's happening. So I don't know for like whatever drug I took. I don't know if we were actually sober after like 12 to 16 hours or if we just started to get nervous. The way that I usually try to tell, and it's probably not the best way, is I'll go look in a mirror. And I know that at like 16 hours, my pupils were still huge in a dark room. But that could be like a lingering effect. Like I'm sure the pupil thing probably lasts quite a bit longer than the mind-altering stuff. So who knows?
I guess it's difficult to. I suspect it was some random research chemical cathinone, but there are so many of them that it's impossible to pin it down. I've also had situations where I've taken amphetamine and 24 hours later, I still can't sleep, even though the initial effects of the substance wore off a long time ago. So it could have been something like that as well.
Yeah, maybe, possibly.
What were the psilocybin experiences that you had that gave you that caused weed to give you more anxiety?
I just I'd had like a I'd eaten like edibles and stuff and smoked a little bit throughout my life. I think the last big like edible that I ate, I think it was around a 25 to 30 milligram cookie. And when
Wow.
I Yeah, for like nobody with no tolerance, I imagine it'd be a decent bit. But like the most I ever get while high is kind of like being like giggly or laughy or whatever. Like like it's kind of like being drunk, but like kind of funny and chill. But I didn't know this, but I never actually gotten high in like a psychedelic way before. Despite however much weed I'd smoked or despite like any edibles I did, it was always kind of like a giggly thing. So I wanted to try mushrooms because people kept saying like, oh, you do mushrooms, you need to have an ego death, it'll change your life and blah, blah, blah. And so the first time I did mushrooms, I wanted to make sure that I was eating like a lot so that I could truly get high. Because I was scared that I would do some mushrooms and it would just be like getting high on weed where I would just like giggle and it'd be like, what the fuck is the point? So I ended up, my first trip was way too many, way too many. And I went from never having a psychedelic experience in my life to like a full on like hardcore ego death. So I think that like fucked with my mind probably for about a year afterwards.
Yeah, that's pretty dangerous. I mean, I've done a lot of dangerous things myself over the years, but yeah, I typically recommend people work their way up incrementally in as they feel comfortable rather than jumping into the deep end.
Yeah, for sure. It was the most amazing experience of my life, but I mean, yeah, it came at a decent cost, I think.
So what happened during? Do you remember any specific details?
Yeah, I mean, it was just so what happened was I took one dose and then I took two more about 30 minutes later. So I think what happened was when I started to get high, the beginning of that trip, I know more about them now that I've done more past that, but I didn't know anything at the time. But when I started to get high, it was probably about maybe like an hour to an hour and a half in from the first 3.5 grams I took. When I started getting high, the walls started to do the really standard where you see the walls kind of breathing and then you see the lights kind of like expanding in ways that it doesn't seem like they should. So that was like pretty cool, maybe for about 5 minutes. And then after that, I got like extremely like tunnel of light fucked. Like one of those things where when you close your eyes, it's like more extreme than when they're open. So it was the feeling of like going through like tunnels of like fractal light for maybe an hour or two. It's hard to say. At that point, I was like so zonked out that you probably could have picked me up and moved me around, and I was completely and totally disconnected. Going into it, I remember because at least for me, I think for most people, mushrooms tend to hit you in waves where it'll be like up and then down and up and down. And every time I would come down a little bit, I remember begging the guy next to me. I was like, oh God, I took way too much. Please don't let me die. I think I'm dying. And then there are a whole bunch of like other phases through that. Like there's a phase of distinctly of like feeling like whoever I used to be died a long time ago, floating through nothingness. At about 3 hours where I started to come into the like my senses are back, but I'm still like incredibly fucking high. I went through a lot of kind of like the looping stuff to where you'll have a thought, like it's never anything interesting. Some people have like, I guess I read about some people's experiences that are really interesting, but mine were all just like, I'm not sure if I exist or not, or if I'm like stuck infinitely in some other reality. So like I'll have a thought and then I kind of follow it a little bit and then I lose it and then I have that same thought again. But since like your whole like my ability to keep track of time was destroyed, I felt like I was getting stuck in places for like years at a time where I was like completely, and there was just like a whole bunch of other like just really stupid shit. The guy that I was with me probably wasn't the best trip sitter. He was like really aggressively like shaking me and asking me what was going on and shit. It was just like, yeah. It was yeah, it's a fun time.
Okay, so it sounds like you went through ego death, got trapped in thought loops. Did you experience any hallucinatory states outside of high-level geometry, the fractals that you mentioned when you were on the other side?
What do you mean by that?
Hallucinations often involve seeing things that have form somewhat akin to a dream. It could be talking to hallucinatory entities, seeing places, people, anything like that, as opposed to complex geometry and fractals. So the tunnels of light were something when my eyes were closed was the first part of the trip. The second part was when I would look at people, they would, it's really hard to describe this. It sounds stupid to say they'd look like four-dimensional. There's actually a couple videos I've seen online that do a good job of this. But like you look at somebody and there's just like the way that they look is like, it looks like there's another dimension to them. It's really hard to explain. But it was like, that was interesting. But in terms of like full-on auditory or visual hallucinations, I don't think I experienced any of that. Like everything that I experienced was, I would say that things definitely looked different.
and sounded different. But I think that was because there was a huge shift in like an underlying feeling. So for instance, like there was a time when I was sitting on the couch and we were like watching TV with like the 3 or 4 other people next to me. And I don't think I was seeing anything that was like totally fake or not there, but I had a distinct feeling that like this was the entirety of the universe and that I'd broken my brain, or I'd escaped and I'd figured out what reality really was. And the reality is just sitting in a room with like these 3 other beings, like watching TV forever. And like occasionally we would trick ourselves into thinking we have normal lives. Like that would be the type of hallucination. It wasn't seeing or hearing things that weren't there. It was like the perception of everything was like very filtered through however fucking high I was.
Yeah. It sounds more like delusional stuff, breakdowns in thoughts, thought loop.
Yeah.
I noticed that delusions tend to pop up a lot when your short-term memory goes to complete shit, causing you to go into thought loops in the presence of other people, which make it really hard to follow social situations and conversation, and things can spiral out of control pretty quickly from there.
Yeah, a little bit. They don't even have to necessarily be doing anything for that to happen, though. Because like sometimes the problem is because my mind is so poisoned, a lot of like innocent things will start to sound incredibly malevolent to me. So like here's an example. I thought I hallucinated this completely, but thankfully it's on my YouTube channel. But there's at least a video of the last half of my trip, and people were saying things where it sounded like my mind was either trying to convince me things were real or weren't real. So the guy next to me was saying things like, isn't it kind of strange that none of us really knew each other that well, and then all of a sudden we decided to have a huge mushroom trip? And when I was really high, him saying things like that sounded like my mind was either fucking with me to show me like there's no way this is real. Like what are the chances I would meet strangers and do drugs with them? I don't even do that many drugs. Or it was like my mind trying to convince me like, no, look, don't worry, like it is real. Like, see, like this guy's commenting on how weird things are, and it's like, fuck, is that just me thinking about it? I remember the last girl that I did drugs with, it was just smoking weed, but now when I smoke weed, I have like a full-on psychedelic experience. It almost feels like mushrooms again. But I remember thinking at one point that I was in the shower, and I started to think for a second because I smoked a bit and I got really high, and I'm in the shower and I'm thinking like, wait a second, is the girl that I'm with, is she actually real? And I remember I called out. And I was like, hey, and then I called their name, and I waited a second, and I talked to them about this stuff before, and they called back to me. I was like, hey, what's wrong? Do you think I'm not real? Like, they said that, and I was like, oh my God, my mind is fucking with me hardcore. So it's just like stuff like that would happen, yeah.
And this was after the experience? How long after was it?
Well, that was like within the past month and a half. Now,
oh really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Marijuana is very, very, very challenging for me now. When I had, I didn't notice this. I'd heard some people say this, but it sounds, no offense to any drug people, but like everything drug people says, I don't believe anything because it all sounds like crazy. But one of the things I'd heard is that like smoking marijuana after mushrooms is like a totally different experience. I didn't believe that. I never heard that. But I did edibles with a friend after I had done mushrooms. And as soon as those edibles kicked in, I immediately like started almost ego death thought looping again, to where everything in my reality like started to break. I thought I was in my past mushroom trip, and I distinctly had this feeling of I'm still on that couch where I was thought looping, and I actually completely broke my mind doing mushrooms. And I was just off of doing, I think it was a 25 milligram chocolate edible, and I had that feeling that I was back in that mushroom trip again. And I'm
pretty high dose of THC. So my cat is going crazy. I might kick him out of the bed.
Yeah, you're fine. I'll knock yourself out. He's just chilling.
Aspar, come on. Come on. Look up the cat, bud. Thank you. But yeah, so I used to trip quite regularly with a pretty large social circle of people, and we would all smoke weed as well. And I recall that not a single one of them didn't have the general character of weed change considerably for them after they started tripping on a regular basis. If you look into HPPD, hallucinogen perception persistence disorder, it's listed as something that's very rare. But as far as I can tell, anyone that trips regularly enough starts getting it to some extent eventually. It doesn't necessarily impair a person's ability to function, but it's pretty damn common. The conclusion I've come to is that if you open a door in your brain, it's just always left slightly ajar for better or worse. There's not much can be done about it, but it does seem to fade away after a few years after the experience if you stop tripping.
Yeah, I definitely have, like, if I smoke now, I know what to expect, and I have like a bit better grounding. Like, it's not as crazy as that first edible thing I did after mushrooms. It was one of the scariest experiences of my life, maybe the scariest, especially because, like, I tried to end up sleeping it off with the person that I was with, and like trying to, or maybe it's just me, but trying to sleep when you're high is a nightmare, especially when you already don't know what reality is or isn't. Like, I would get high, I'd have crazy thoughts, I'd fall asleep, I'd start to dream high and get fucked, and then I'd wake up and I wasn't even sure if I was high or sober yet, and then another wave would hit me, and I was just like, it was the worst idea in the world. Yeah.
So is this the only psychedelic trip you've had, or have you tripped aside from this?
No, I've had a couple more trips. I had one more that I would say is like an ego death level trip, which was an accident, to where we had mushrooms and we thought they were bad. It was ground up shrooms and capsules. And we ended up dosing up to what should have been a full trip, 3.5 milligrams, and then, or 3.5 grams. And then, but unfortunately they didn't kick in for like 2 or 3 hours. So we figured like they were pretty old, and we're like, well, maybe they're bad or whatever. And then we kept eating more and more and more and more. And then I remember joking. I was like, damn, dude, what if these started to kick in? We had a friend on the phone that we were like hanging out with too. And then after I'd gotten up to 8 grams, all of a sudden it started to kick in. And then it was like, whoosh, like super ultra pulled in. Like I remember trying to, shut off the laptop because it felt like the song that was playing in the corner of the room was playing indefinitely. But I can't operate screens when I'm that high. So it's like I'm trying to like crawl out of the bedroom. I'm talking to the person that I'm with, saying that they need to get away from me. And then as soon as they step away, I'm like screaming for them to come back because I don't know if I'm like alone in another dimension. It was just like another kind of bad experience. That one was easier though, because I knew a little bit more. Once I'd started to get into it, I had a little bit more of an idea of what to expect. So it wasn't as traumatic as the first time. But other than that, I've done like a few smaller trips that have been like fun. But yeah, with LSD and mushrooms.
Okay. So it hasn't completely ruined psychedelics for you or anything. I've heard of a lot of people having traumatic experience on psychedelics and then not going back to them for very long periods of time.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's ruined it, but it unfortunately it makes it hard to have fun. So like if somebody asks me, like a lot of people seem to like to smoke weed. If somebody asks me if I want to smoke weed, I have to tell them like I can do it, but like this is like a challenging experience. Like smoking weed for you is like going through a walk through a park, but for me it's like a 50-50 between walking through the park and like having to climb a mountain, and I don't know what it's going to be until I start to get high, and then I get that feeling. So it makes it harder to enjoy them because I have to be like mentally prepared every time I do any drug that like alters my mind. Yeah.
I have trouble with THC as well. I find it to be incredibly anxiety-inducing. I've tried over 200 individual psychoactive compounds, and I actually find it easier to handle a powerful psychedelic like DMT than I do THC. It seems to just induce anxiety as a fundamental component of the experience, and it's just unpleasant.
Yeah. So here's a question I had. So I've wanted to try like maybe like 4 or 5 tabs of LSD to see if I could hit like a similar crazy level. But the thing that scares me the most is that like on really high dosages, when you're like at 5 grams plus of mushrooms, for me, if truly does feel like it lasts forever. And once you're in the heat of, the depth of, like the most mind-breaking parts of those experiences, it feels like you're trapped for an eternity. And I look at like LSD and I'm like, LSD is a solid like 10 to 12 hours of being high. Like
long duration? Yeah,
so I'm curious, does it feel even worse if you try ego deathing like LSD, that you're stuck in some place for even longer?
So my recommendation to you for something like that, if you're worried about getting stuck in a situation that you want to be able to bail out of, is to keep some benzodiazepines on hand. Often when I've tripped in large social settings, I will just have like a little cup on a coffee table with some benzodiazepines, and those are the analogous equivalent to an ejector seat button. And just knowing that you can bail out at any moment makes it much easier to go through the experience, because you know you're not trapped there. If it gets too much, you can just take a benzo and it'll chill you out. So I find that very personally helpful. I would definitely recommend doing that.
Do you think that, because I've heard DMT When I read about DMT trips, they sound like really extreme mushroom trips, but I've heard they are more intense. Does it feel like a long time on DMT if it's truly only if you have a breakthrough experience, but it's only 15 minutes? Does that feel similar to like?
So it, generally speaking, unless you have a really powerful experience that induces some kind of time distortion that makes it feel like an eternity or whatever, it does just feel like 5 to 10 minutes. DMT has this, it's kind of like this cultural thing that's been put on a pedestal that it doesn't need to be on. In my opinion, it's just another psychedelic. Like I would actually recommend low doses of DMT to beginner trippers that haven't tried a psychedelic before, because it has a dosage range like any other, and it can give a person a mild to moderate psychedelic experience for only 5 minutes, so they're in and they're out. And that's much better than them having to commit to a 6 to 8 or 12-hour trip. It's also a lot less disorientating than something like psilocybin mushrooms. It doesn't induce as many cognitive changes in quite the same way. So you're more with it as you're going through the experience than you are on something like mushrooms or LSD.
Okay, interesting. I don't know if you have like a description for this, and I wish there was a way to like perfectly dose or capture this, but there are, and so I felt this on my first trip was 10.5 grams, but I've done trips that are as small as 2 to 3.5 grams. So like either light trips or like what would be like a full trip. And in every single one of these, regardless of dosage, it always feels like there is a time where you step into like another dimension where you actually feel like cognitively sober, but you're obviously high out of your fucking mind in like another world. Is there like is there like a way to like hit that area? Does that make sense when I talk about that? Where we're like, yeah, go.
Okay. So your sensory perception has changed, as in you are no longer in the room, you've gone into a hallucinatory space, but your cognition feels relatively sober. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I feel like I'm like, okay, cool. I'm at a place. I'm not getting, especially on mushrooms, I'm not getting sucked into some area that's like my pineal gland or whatever is like fucking trying to keep me along. But I'm in another place, but I'm still clearly fucking high. But I can like have a conversation or like exist in this area. And it's very like clearly like another kind of space that's really cool.
Yeah, that's pretty common. I would say that that's very common on DMT in particular. That you maintain some sort of cognitive awareness. I think it's just a psychedelic equivalent to being in a lucid dream, as opposed to a regular dream where you're just believing the plot and kind of going along with it. That you can maintain some sort of awareness. I imagine things like your short-term memory are probably completely destroyed in that moment. But if you're in a hallucinatory space, then you're not really going to notice that your short-term memory is gone.
Yeah, that might be the case, and I don't notice, but it certainly doesn't feel that way. Like in these spaces, I feel like I could have like a decent conversation with somebody, and I could like enjoy myself, and I'm not like there are no like thought loops in this area where I'm like starting to loop indefinitely, and I'm worried I'm like trapped somewhere. It just feels like I'm sober, but like in another reality kind of. Obviously, I'm probably not, right? But yeah,
I experience a lot, in particular, particularly with dissociatives. I can be holding on a dissociative. You're breaking through on it, say, ketamine or DXM or something.
Okay.
But mentally, I feel quite with it. And if I'm with another person, I can even speak to them while I feel my awareness floating through something that's completely different from my actual real-life external environment.
Okay, interesting. I wanted to try dissociatives, but after I did mushrooms, at 30 years old, for the first time in my life, I started to get panic attacks for about a year and a half. And one of the feelings I'd have after the panic attacks was being very, I looked it up and there's 3 terms: disassociation, depersonalization, and derealization. And I see all of these kind of used somewhat interchangeably, but I started to get feelings related to derealization and depersonalization. And that was really scary. So I wanted to try... I was curious about trying ketamine, but I was really worried trying it. I've done like
I would recommend it.
Do you know what whippets are?
Yeah, nitrous oxide.
Yeah, so I've done those a little bit, which I guess is like 5 seconds of ketamine, kind of. Or
it's somewhat similar, but it doesn't really fully capture the whole dissociative experience. And obviously, the duration is really short. Yeah.
Yeah. What does ketamine feel like? I guess compared to like mushrooms or LSD.
So it's almost the pharmacological opposite of a psychedelic in some ways. Psychedelics cause your brain to become more interconnected. Regions of your brain will communicate with each other that wouldn't usually. But a dissociative blocks electrical signals between your neurons, so it causes you to disconnect from your senses and your cognition and become increasingly dissociated until you detach from your external environment completely. And that's when you go into the K-hole. The thing about dissociatives is they're really chill. They seem to fundamentally, at least the majority of them, decrease anxiety. So to ego death on a dissociative is a very serene and relaxing experience in comparison to, say, ego deathing on psilocybin, which can be fucking terrifying.
I've always heard K-holes described as like really traumatic.
Really?
Yeah, is that? But that's like, yeah, I don't
that's not how I see them, and that's
okay.
Not how the majority of people I know have interpreted them. Like they're becoming increasingly used for therapy in like mainstream psychiatry in America. Ketamine in particular.
Interesting, gotcha. I also hear a lot of people describe LSD as being a lot more intense than mushrooms, but my experience with that is exactly the opposite. So maybe, yeah, I don't know.
So it seems to differ between people. A lot of people find psilocybin to be way more anxiety-inducing, but find LSD to be pretty recreational and comparatively shallow in a way that lends for more of a party drug. But some people find it to be the other way around. If I had to guess, I think most people find psilocybin to be more anxiety-inducing than LSD.
Yeah.
I certainly do.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Yeah, but what do you think about like, what's your favorite drug? I'm curious.
My favorite drug. So that's really hard to say. I have a lot of favorite drugs for specific situations. So I'll have a favorite psychedelic for, say, a hedonistic situation that might be 2CB or 4-HO-MIPT. But if I want to have a deep, spiritual or profound experience, then I would probably prefer something along the lines of ayahuasca or 4-ASO-DMT or psilocybin. Things like pure hedonism, I tend to lean more towards kratom and things that aren't, straight up hallucinogens. I also use a lot of nootropics and stuff in my day-to-day life just to help keep me productive.
Gotcha. Okay. How long do you think you should wait between MDMA dosages or doings or trips?
Okay, so a lot of people do MDMA far too much. They say you need to wait at least 3 months between doses, but I think were you to keep that up long term, doing MDMA every 3 months, it would damage your brain. It does seem to be inherently neurotoxic due to the way it causes serotonin and dopamine to cross over into the respective receptor of the other neurotransmitter and all the oxidative stress and stuff. Like, it's pretty bad for the brain. In the long run, I would say about once a year.
Damn. Okay.
Yeah. How often do you do MDMA?
Don't worry about it. Not that often though. I mean, some people go crazy with it. Some people do. Some people will, like, for an entire summer are doing it Friday, Saturday, Sunday while they're partying and shit. But yeah, I try. I guess my goal was always never more than like once a month, but I don't do it that often. But I try to follow that 3-month rule, but I'm also not doing it like every 3 months either. But yeah.
Yeah. I recommend taking antioxidants and magnesium and various other supplements when you're doing it as well. That reduces the neurotoxicity a pretty massive amount.
Gotcha.
But yeah, there's also the problem that if you keep doing it, eventually the magic just sort of goes for most people. Like, it has this entactogenic effect where you're overwhelmed with feelings of empathy and love. But if you do that around people enough, eventually you just kind of run out of things to gush about, and it becomes this weird, sketchy stimulant. At least I've experienced this, and then you have to wait a long period of time for the magic to come back, as they call it.
Okay. Interesting. What do you said you work in research? What do you do for research?
Yeah, so I've entered the field of psychedelic research through very atypical means. I started a project when I was 17, I'm 29 now, in which I realized there was no formal classification systems for the psychedelic experience or subjective effects in general. So I started writing a subjective effect index, which has kind of grown into a collection of around 250 individual subjective effects that formally describes and documents altered state of consciousness in meticulous detail. So everything from specific visual distortions to minutiae of cognitive effects, transpersonal and spiritual experiences, hallucinatory entities, a lot of stuff like that. And I built up a big sort of community following around that. I haven't entered this through traditional academia by any means. And since the psychedelic research industry has taken off in the last few years, I've had a lot of people who are in more mainstream research reaching out to me. And now I'm getting funding to put together something that is going to be analogous to that of the DSM, but for altered states of consciousness, so that researchers can have a universal terminology set to discuss, describe, and study things like psychedelic experiences and altered states of consciousness in general, be they induced by drugs or meditation or whatever.
Interesting. Okay, that would be cool. Really, really hard. I'm sure, obviously, right, to study because it's hard to tell one person's subjective experience from another. It seems like, how do you overcome that? Like trying to make commensurate two people's different experiences.
So, I mean, a lot of it is just you need to be very broad in the amount of altered states of consciousness, ASDs, I guess, that you're capturing. But I think there's more. There's a lot of effects that are genuinely universal to some extent. The rates at which they occur between people might be different, but there's a lot more commonality than you might think. I think the next step is we're trying to take substances that have been broadly assayed, so we know what receptors in the brain they affect and the general regions of the brain they affect, and then we're trying to correlate that receptor modulation with specific subjective states so that we can develop a predictive model that will you could input different factors into it. So you could say at this weight, at this dosage on this substance, you have this percentage likelihood of experiencing this given set of subjective states and therefore these therapeutic outcomes. So a lot of it is just studying trip reports, studying my own firsthand experiences. And right now we're doing a literature review of different altered state of consciousness classification systems in which we're just cross-comparing them and trying to merge them into one unified system. Okay. There's a lot of different psychometric scales and informal classification systems based on people's own experiences that vary wildly in quality. Some of them are pretty crazy, but we're trying to make sense of them regardless.
Gotcha. I feel like kind of related to this. I don't know if you have an opinion on this. So something I noticed after my mushroom trip with smoking, it feels like people have wildly different experiences with marijuana. I think it's one of the most varied drugs. So like I'll see people that will smoke like every day and they'll talk about like, oh yeah, like I smoke and then I go out and I do stuff or whatever. But I feel like when I smoke, it's like a full on, like very psychedelic experience. Not like it was before. And then I kind of wonder, it's like, it feels like when people get high, it feels like not everybody's getting high in the same way. Or if they are, I can't believe that they're like out functioning normally like a human with all this stuff going on. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts related to...
That is definitely true. I have friends that will smoke weed and they say, yeah, it reduces my anxiety, it calms me down, it helps me focus and be productive. But I smoke weed and I turn into an anxious wreck and I can't focus at all. So it's just not for me. I think there's variations in people's different neurochemistry that cause them to respond differently to these substances.
Do you think there's something everybody should try at least once?
I think the majority of people should try a psychedelic experience at least once. Not everybody. There's a lot of people that shouldn't trip because it's damaging to their mental health, or they start getting delusional and manic and coming up with all these crazy theories about how the universe works. But I think for the vast majority of people, having a psychedelic experience on psilocybin or DMT, it would be extremely beneficial. It's not a miracle cure by any means, but it's beneficial enough that I think if a higher percentage of people in society use them, that it would have really positive effects for just society in general.
Have you ever tried like, and obviously you can be as personal or unpersonal as you want. Have you ever tried like opiates? Like have you ever done like heroin or anything like that before? Or?
I have. Kratom is an opioid.
Kratom is,
it's legal and it's widely available. We have Kratom bars here in Colorado, and I go to them pretty regularly. But yeah, I've tried all of the of the ones, all of the bad ones.
Were you
they're
ever
okay.
worried trying anything that you were gonna get like instantaneously addicted or anything? Or?
So it seems that different people have different propensities for getting addicted to different classes of substances. Some people are opioid people. Some people are alcohol people. I'm not an opioid person. Like some people are stimulant people. I'm not a stimulant person either. I'm more prone to getting addicted to things like benzodiazepines, but I'm not addicted to anything. These days, alcoholism runs in my family, so I assume that's related because they both affect the GABA system. But yeah, I don't get enough enjoyment out of opioids to get addicted to them in that way. But they're playing with fire. I would recommend that people just stay away from them.
Gotcha.
All of the people that I know who have died from drug overdoses, there's always opioids involved. It's not worth it.
Interesting. Okay. I've read a bit about addiction, and it seems like people are always going back and forth between like addictive personalities versus like I know that like some addictions are very highly heritable, like alcoholism for sure is one of them. Other people point to life conditions. I'm responsible, so however highly I think of myself, I'm not going to be like, I can do heroin and not bother. Nothing will happen. But I've never done a drug and understood like, wow, I could totally be addicted. Like I've had alcohol, it's disgusting. I've tried cigarettes, don't like it. But MDMA is a drug where when I've tried it, I'm like, the temptation to like re-up is very, very, very high. And depending on who I'm with or what the situation is, like I could see myself like dying happy, just like eating handfuls of this shit. And it's like, whatever happens, happens. And then I kind of wonder for things like heroin, if I would have a similar response where it's like, oh my God, this is, you know what? Dying actually here would be okay. Because this is just the best feeling in the world. I never know.
If you haven't, it's hard to say, but it sounds like at the very least you might be a stimulant person.
Maybe I haven't done many stimulants, but I've never tried I haven't tried like cocaine yet or anything, which seems like it'd be fun, but I don't know.
Yeah, the thing about addiction that a lot of people seem to overlook is it doesn't just induce a physical craving. It starts to change the very fabric of your thought structure, which causes you to justify and come up with reasons to continue doing the thing. And it's really hard to get around that because you logic your way into it without
you can 100%. Like even what I was saying before, the only reason I have those thoughts because I've thought about it on MDMA where it's like, okay, some people will party every fucking weekend with this shit. Like if I go from 200 to 300 milligrams, is it really that big of a deal? Like, okay, maybe it's a little neurotoxic, but like just once, like my brain will recover. Like it's not a big deal. Or like, you're not gonna OD on like, even if it's like, you can like very quickly bullshit your way into like, I've had like 7 fucking, I haven't done that much ever, thank God. But like, I feel like you could very quickly bullshit your way into like insanely high dosages and you're just like, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, I've done that a lot. It's like what could possibly go wrong sort of situation. The whole the most common way to OD on MDMA I've noticed is that people will take it and think, oh, it's not working, it's not doing anything within the first hour, and then they'll redose and it's too much. But it's definitely possible to get to pretty dangerous levels with that.
Yeah. My biggest issue with some drugs, I feel like it's never talked about enough. People will mention it in one breath and then never mention it again. What you've had to eat is like a hugely important thing for drugs. So I've had like the 8 gram mushroom trip I did was intense. It was my second mushroom trip, or my second big one. And it was like, obviously it was really, really, really intense. I've had 1 gram, 2 gram, and 3.5 gram trips that were nice. They were like fun. The getting high part on mushrooms is always a little challenging for me as you're starting to get pulled up. It's like, oof. But like once you're there, it's like cool. I remember one time with a friend though, and I'm like, okay, 2 ego death mushroom trips. It's easy. We're going to do 2 grams. It'll be fun. Like don't even have to sweat it. We hadn't eaten all day and we'd had like the liquid version of like the mushrooms, and I remember we mixed it with Pepsi because like, oh, if you mix it with an acid it like gets you high faster or whatever. Hadn't had anything to eat all day, dipped it into the thing, and this was the only time in my life I had like a 2-hour mushroom trip. But it was so fucking intense that it felt like I was on like an insane amount again. I remember because there was a point where she wanted to talk about something and I was like crawling out of the room like dying, and it was just 2 grams. I was like, no fucking way, what happened? I was like, yeah, Jesus.
So Did you come up quicker and the duration was also shorter but more intense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You drank it with Pepsi?
Yeah, because I've heard of like lemon tech or whatever. So I was like, oh,
Yeah,
Pepsi should
you
work.
accidentally lemon teched it, because usually if you just eat a mushroom, your body has to break down the psilocybin into psilocin. But if you can just kind of do that externally by mixing it with an acid.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to break it down, so it hit you all at once.
Yeah, and it was way more intense than I thought, because I'm like 2 grams is gonna be like, I don't even know if I'll get like super high. I don't even know if I have a mushroom trip. But yeah, it was definitely a very extreme moment, and I was not ready for that at all.
Yeah, doing that on an empty stomach and lemon teching is gonna make it harder and faster twice over, I guess.
I noticed for MDMA, what you've eaten before is like really important too. That if I like nowadays, if I ever do MDMA, it has to be on an empty stomach, because if I eat a full meal, even like an hour or two beforehand, and then I do MDMA, unless I've just gotten unlucky, I feel like the experience is very blunted. Like it'll still feel good and it'll still be fun, but that extreme emotional feeling won't be there if I've eaten within like the past like hour or two before actually taking the pills.
Yeah, if you eat on a full stomach, it can take up to 3 hours to come on as well.
Yeah.
And it can also massively increase the nausea.
Oh,
Like,
I haven't
there's
had that
one thing
thankfully, but yeah.
But you haven't?
No, I haven't had nausea on mushrooms ever either, which I've heard is like pretty lucky. So, but I don't get nauseous very often.
Yeah,
ever.
it's pretty standard to throw up on the come up of these substances. I tend to mix it with ondansetron, which blocks the serotonin receptors in your stomach.
What is that, like a cheat code to get more high, or?
No, it removes the nausea completely.
Oh. Well, if I ever get nauseous, I'll remember that.
Ondansetron, yeah, it's easy to get a hold of.
Do you believe that MDMA come downs are real?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
People experience them to a different extent, but forcing your brain to release and reuptake inhibit a bunch of serotonin and dopamine is going to cause there to be less serotonin and dopamine later on, which is really bad for mood regulation. It tends to be the day after your dose that it hits people, because there's still some of that at play in the morning after an MDMA experience. But yeah, I generally need to use sorry, my throat's a bit fucky. Generally need to use 5-HTP to just keep my serotonin at normal levels, although I don't use MDMA very often these days for these reasons, pretty much.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, have you heard the term Suicide Tuesdays?
No, is it with people that do MDMA on Saturday and feel shit on?
Yeah, so or Suicide Mondays. So they'll take the MDMA Saturday night, feel fine on Sunday, and experience suicide Monday the next day.
Jeez. Okay.
As in they're just extremely depressed.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's definitely a thing.
Okay, interesting. I've tried to do
you experience that?
never, not in my life. I've tried to do like a lot of research on MDMA, and it's really hard. Obviously, it's hard to find research on anything, because like for any of these given substances, when it comes to things like neurotoxicity, there's really only going to be like a handful of like actual good studies where I don't know if there's a single like prospective randomized. I don't think there's anything like that. All of these are retrospectives. All of these are pretty low sample sizes. It's pretty hard to find any data. I've seen a lot of stuff written on MDMA where so I've heard some people say that it's theorized that it's not neurotoxic at all as long as you regulate body temperature. That in that case, it's like much safer, but a lot of the neurotoxicity that's induced will be because people tend to overheat and overexert themselves a lot, and that could cause it to be worse. I don't know if that's true. When it comes to like come down stuff, I've heard that the MDMA come down can be illusory to a large extent, because what actually happens is people are partying a lot and then they get really bad sleep, they don't eat, and they don't drink any water. So it's kind of like they'll wake up with this sort of hangover, plus the fact that their mood is so shifted that they kind of have this feeling of like, oh my God, there's a huge come down, when in reality they just like slept like shit or whatever. They not drink any water, and they have a big mood swing. But it's hard to tell for sure. I know that I've gotten lucky in that I've never had my days after MDMA are usually super chill and like very mellow in like a good way. Like I'm usually like really relaxed. I'm like, oh, this is like super chill. And I've always had that experience. But
your neurochemistry is probably quite sturdy and well balanced.
Oh yeah, maybe. I'm like a pretty happy person. Like I'm a pretty upbeat person normally anyway. But yeah, you can always tell on stream when I've done like MDMA, because like for the next day or two, I'll usually be like very chilled. So
I'll have to keep an eye out.
Yeah. What else? Anything else?
So, do you think you're going to try any psychedelics aside from LSD and psilocybin in the future? I feel like you might benefit from DMT.
Yeah, I think I really want to try DMT. I'm just I get really scared. I hear so
That's
many.
understandable.
Yeah, the mushroom trip
But
is really traumatic, so I'm always scared of getting locked in another dimension again. But
yeah. Well, you can start with a very small amount and work your way up if you want to. That's what I recommend. And weirdly enough, low doses of DMT can be surprisingly relaxing.
okay, interesting.
Yeah, it surprises a lot of people when I tell them to try it at a low dose.
Do you need somebody to help you with like the third? Like I've only read obviously. Do you need somebody to help you with the third hit to actually have a breakthrough in DMT? Like, will you actually be that out of it, or what do you think?
You can do it yourself. It helps if there's someone there. So sometimes you can get into the situation where you're coming up very fast, and whatever smoking utensil device you're using, it becomes an incomprehensible mass of geometry that's just completely unrecognizable as any sort of human object, and you're just looking at like,
Sure.
what do I do with it?
Okay.
So it can help to have a person there being like, here, take an extra hit, but it's not necessary. You can kind of get it with practice.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you can you interact with screens when you're really high on substances, on psychedelic things? Is that like a universal experience, or like if I'm really high, I can't, like looking at my phone and anything is like really, really, really difficult.
I can, but if it's a heavy dose experience, I probably need to just turn off all of my devices and generally ignore them, because
Gotcha.
getting sucked into talking to people online and stuff can do weird things to your state of mind. It really depends on how hard I'm tripping.
Sure. Have you ever had the experience? So this is something that's really common when when I'm on really big dosages of stuff. Have you ever had the experience of you go to check your phone and it's like 11:02 and you put it down and you're like tripping and you're having a huge experience for quite a while and you're kind of wondering, like, I don't know if it's like midnight yet, maybe it's 1 or 2 or 3, and then you pick up your phone and it's like 11:03, like 1 minute has passed and you're like, holy shit. Or you've picked it up and it's still 11:02. Do you ever that's like a really common experience if I try to like check time a lot when I'm on like really big trips.
Yeah, super common. It's in the subjective effect index as time dilation. I mean, your sense of time can be distorted, but I think something to do with having such a huge amount of experience and intensity of experience in such a short period of time can cause you to feel like more time has passed than it actually has. Like an hour can feel like an eternity, or even a second can feel like an eternity.
I will say one of the most interesting things that I ever saw was when I was doing the really big 10.5 gram mushroom trip. When I was talking to a friend, I very distinctly remember that. So he was shaking me, asking me, like, because I would keep saying like, oh God, like, don't let me go away, or don't let me slip away, or I don't want to go somewhere, or whatever. I would say something like this, and then I would like another wave, it would feel like would hit, and then I feel like I'd slip off into another place for, like, I'm saying it feels like days or months or hours. I don't know, whatever it is. It feels like long periods of time. And he'd be like shaking me, like, where are you going? Where are you going? And then I'd like come back and I'd be like, oh shit. And watching that back on video was really funny, because like every time I slipped away, it was really only lasting for about a second on the video, like 1 or 2 seconds. And then I'd come back and like, oh my God, this felt so much different, like in the middle of the trip. It's really interesting to see on video. Yeah.
What were you experiencing when you went away for?
I'd have to go back and watch my video that I made right after I had my trip, but I don't remember. But I remember that every time I would slip away, it would feel like these other areas that I'm in, it would feel like weeks or months of time. But I say that, but now retrospectively, like, what's the difference between a week and a month and a year and an hour? I don't know when you're in that state. I'm not sure, but it felt like long periods of time were passing. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about experiencing, say, months or weeks of hallucination in an impossibly short period of time, a second, a few minutes, whatever. I'm skeptical that the brain can generate that much content in such a short period of time. I suspect it's more just adjusting the perception of how long you felt it was. And when there are accompanying hallucinations, I've been through this before, looking back on it, there's always a lot of jump cuts.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Yeah, I would never say like, have you seen like Rick and Morty?
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not like I would come back after 1 second. It's like, oh my God, I just lived a fully detailed and entertaining life with like somebody else. Like it would never be a thing like that. It would always be like kind of like thought loops, or like being in different areas and having the feeling that a lot of time is passing. But it's not like there's not a lot of content there that's filling that time. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, a lot of people do hallucinate that they did just live a fully detailed life though.
Oh,
But
interesting. Okay.
I'm skeptical that that's actually what happened, and it's not just how you feel about it looking back on it with a bunch of jump cuts.
Yeah, yeah, most likely for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that seems more likely to me. People believe some pretty wild and irrational stuff when it comes to high level psychedelic experiences.
Which I don't
Particularly,
I don't blame anybody for, but yeah, go ahead. Particularly.
yeah, I get it. I understand it. There's often this experience, for example, during DMT breakthroughs, that what you're experiencing is realer than real. It feels realer than anything you've ever experienced in your real life, and that can kind of lead people down some interesting trains of thoughts in regards to whether or not, say, DMT entities are fifth dimensional aliens or time travelers from the future. A lot of things like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I could only imagine being like going into a DMT trip and being like very religious has got to be like like the most cool experience in the world too, because I'm sure you're having like some spiritual shit as well or something. But yeah.
Yeah, these substances seem to enhance people's propensity to be religious or develop spiritual frameworks in general. People will often start using psychedelics on a regular basis, and then just have an urge to devise this bigger picture theory about how the universe works, and then stick to that very intensely. And I feel like it might activate some part of the brain related to that, but that's pure conjecture.
Yeah, I imagine it probably, whatever you have a propensity for, it's probably going to exaggerate that on whatever trip. Yeah. How would you, so obviously being responsible, not advocating for anybody doing any of these particular drugs, but so somebody that's done MDMA and have you like, is it intravenous through injection? You've done heroin before?
No,
Oh, you haven't done?
never.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to ask.
No, I mean, I've insufflated it, but back in my more reckless youth, when I was a lot more mentally unstable, I would never, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. I mean, not just because it's really sketchy, but I want a medical professional or something along those lines.
What's another? Okay, well, if I'm an amphetamine person and I'm likely to get addicted to these, what's another cool amphetamine to try or stimulant?
If you like MDMA, have you tried MDA?
I don't know, not intentionally.
Do you know what it is?
Nope.
So it's I think it actually came before MDMA, but it's more psychedelic.
Okay.
It's less entactogenic. The entactogenic aspect is still there, but it leans much more heavily in a psychedelic direction.
Okay.
So you would probably enjoy that, I imagine.
Interesting.
Or I bet you would also enjoy 2CB a lot.
I've heard that one recommended a lot. I've just never tried it before. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like MDMA light mixed with LSD light in one substance.
Gotcha. Have you ever tried like candy flipping before, or do you have like favorite like mixtures of drugs?
Yeah, I've tried candy flipping. I like mixing small amounts of lots of different compounds to produce an experience that's still only moderate in strength. So a small amount of 2CB with a very small amount of 4-ASO-DMT, which is essentially the same as psilocin, is a really good combination. Psychedelics and dissociatives together are really incredible. The dissociatives take the edge off of the psychedelics, and then the psychedelic add more hallucinatory depth to the dissociative compound.
Gotcha. Have you ever taken any drug? So I've done really massive mushroom trips, but aside from like the fractal patterns of light, if I close my eyes, I've never seen, like I've never, there's a name for this. I've never actually had a hallucination. I've just had like distortions. Have you ever done a drug that's caused a full on, like you're seeing like like something that's just completely and totally not there before, or?
Yeah, so the three main classes of hallucinogen are psychedelics, dissociatives, and deliriants. Okay. You don't want to do deliriants. The most common one is Benadryl, which you can pick up at 7-Eleven.
Okay.
But it's an antihistamine substance, and at high doses, it will do what a conservative old lady would expect a psychedelic to do, like full-blown hallucinations of people within your external environment, insects, going to places that you're not actually present in, like dreaming while you're awake.
Is this
And
called?
then
Is this what robo tripping is or whatever? Is that?
no, so robo tripping is DXM.
Oh, okay. You mentioned that before. Gotcha.
Dextromethorphan, I think, and that's a dissociative somewhat similar to ketamine.
Okay.
It's very widely available at pharmacies. It has a bit of a bad reputation because whether or not you respond well to it depends on which enzymes you have, and 1 in 10 people can't metabolize it at all. So if they take it, they'll just trip for 2 days and have incredibly negative side effects.
Okay.
It's also used by a lot of teenagers, which gives it the kiddie drug association. But if it works for you, you have the enzyme set up for it, it can be just as powerful and deep as any of the classical hallucinogens.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else?
I think that's about it.
Okay. Well, if there's anything you ever want to chat about related to drugs or anything like that, I guess you can always shoot me a message and we can chat if you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. If you ever have any questions related to drugs, you're always welcome to hit me up.
Yeah, I gotcha. Trying to wait. Hold on. Some people in chat are asking questions.
Oh, they are? I'd be happy. I'm not looking at chat in case people are saying mean things.
No, you're fine.
I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Let's see. Can you please ask? Okay, this guy's asking a ton. Datura, a mega niche drug with some crazy claims.
Oh, yeah, I've tried Datura.
What do you feel about it?
So, when smoked, it's not. Do you know what Datura is?
No clue. Nothing.
Okay, so it's in the same class of substance as diphenhydramine, Benadryl, DPH. It's a
Okay.
delirium.
Gotcha.
But it's found in a plant that's on every continent apart from Antarctica. Very common. It puts you into a delirium state of mind for sometimes 24 to 48 hours, and it's extremely dangerous. There's no way to dose it. It can kill you. I've done it from smoking it, and that seems to be a safer way to do it. I couldn't even get it to a point where it would cause me legitimate delirium effects, but it would just sort of give me a stoning sensation. And I smoked it somewhat regularly until eventually I started to notice that I was seeing things in my peripheral vision. Looking over to it, it wasn't actually there, like a person in the corner of the room. So I decided to stop smoking Datura. Yeah.
Gotcha.
I tried it at a very low dose orally once, and it made my mouth so dry, which I had problems with already, that I couldn't swallow. And I decided that I'm not going to do a high dose of that because that sounds terrible.
What's been like your scariest drug experience?
My scariest drug experience. So, back when I was a lot less mentally stable, I'm actually quite well adjusted now, believe it or not, but I would take 2CP, which is a phenethylamine psychedelic related to 2CB, and I would get into a state of mind where I was experiencing what I interpreted to be unspeakable horrors.
Okay.
So just endless hallucinations of the most terrifying things that the simulation framework of my brain could possibly conjure up, comprised of condensed psychedelic geometry, which through a weird form of synesthesia just represented pure fear or horror. And it was just endless, just like gorescapes, demons, just all the generic Lovecraftian heavy metal kind of gory, terrible stuff you can think of. I remember being hung upside down in a web by some sort of parasitic creature called the mind worm, as like insects burrowed into my wrist to lay eggs, and it was okay, but yeah, it was pretty scary.
Okay, wait, was this like while you were high, or did this last afterwards, or?
Oh no, this was during the peak
going
of the experience. I was going through complete ego death. I was in a hallucinatory space.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't think it was specific to that drug, but it was just a very powerful hallucinogen, and I was not in a good state of mind when I was using it.
Okay. Gotcha. Can you explain to me? So first, I'll ask this question: when you say ego death, what does that mean to you?
So, that ego death is a pretty poorly defined term. I've done a lot of research into what it means to different people, but generally speaking, it's a disruption in your sense of ego or your sense of self. So that there are different ways in which it can manifest. For some people, it refers to a state of non-dualistic unity in which your sense of self becomes applied to not just your thought stream or your body or your vague conception of who you are as a person, but to your external environment and your model of reality as a whole. So in that state of mind, you feel that you are the environment or the universe experiencing itself through the particular point within it that your consciousness or body happens to reside. Other forms of ego death can come from things like long-term memory suppression, where you forget what anything is. You don't know your name, you don't know what drugs are, you don't know what anything is. If somebody asked you your name, you would not be able to tell them, and at that point it feels that there is no longer a you, there is just conscious awareness experiencing input, and there's nothing to assess it or judge it.
Okay.
There's just experience. Other forms can feel like you become separate from your sense of self, and it's become like an object rather than a subject. So you're distinct from it, and you're experiencing it as something separate from yourself. Other forms are ego fragmentation, where your sense of self feels like it's splitting into or dividing into increasingly smaller components until you no longer feel that you're present. Those are the main forms.
Okay, interesting. Gotcha.
Yeah, it can manifest in a lot of different ways, and it can be triggered by different things as well.
Gotcha. I guess the way that I kind of felt ego death was that like it feels like when we're working well, we have kind of this one unified conscious experience. And it feels like when you take enough of certain drugs, it feels like it starts to break down a lot of these underlying processes that all form to make this coherent, like unified experience. And the scary part, at least for me, was to see how much you could kind of like break away from that, and then you see what's left. And it's like I kind of just assumed that like being conscious is this thing that you obviously always are, and I didn't realize how much underlying stuff was at play until you start to break some of it down. So like really fundamental things, like, and it sounds weird to say it, but like the sense of who you are, or like being able to mark time, or being able to create like short-term, like when you start to break apart all this stuff, then whatever's left experiencing that is like a distinctly different thing than your normal kind of like coherent, like day-to-day self, like non-drug self, I guess.
Yeah, there seems to be a very common neurological process where the brain has a conception of what it is and what it is not. And it differs between people to varying extents, but to most people it's just like their body or even just their thought stream or their brain. And when you disrupt that process on a neurological level, it's speculated that it's tied into something called the default mode network, which is essentially just your general thought stream, or the network that activates when you're daydreaming or just thinking. It turns off often during high-dose psychedelic experiences. But yeah, that will just disrupt your sense of self, and you end up going through ego death. It can be a very profound and beneficial experience.
Yeah, so
often related to turning a computer off and on again. It's helpful to do that occasionally.
So this is going to be my next question, and it might just be that I'm just not good enough yet. But I've heard people describe ego death as like it can be an incredibly freeing experience, or it can be like you have like a profound like sense of the universe or something afterwards. It's always been really difficult for me to deal with. Do you think that's just a matter of like people say like it's because you're not letting go enough or something, or what is like? Can you explain what is the profound? Or have you ever had an ego death and afterwards you feel like, oh, this is like a profound effect? Like I felt like really good after doing this. Like yeah.
Yeah, I've had a lot of really beneficial ego death experiences, particularly the ones that relate to states of non-dualism or unity, feeling one with the universe, as they say. But it sounds like you don't let go.
Okay.
You were describing fighting, drifting off, and then coming back, and then fighting it again. That results in a pretty negative experience quite consistently. It's not for everyone. So I
you know, like, could anybody theoretically, if they were willing to do it enough, could anybody like learn to enjoy it, or are some people just? Do you think they're just kind of like cut off from ever enjoying something like that, or?
I suspect most people could benefit from it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Interesting. So here's like this is just kind of like a personal question related. I'm just kind of curious. When you feel like you're having that disconnected experience where you feel like this kind of like oneness with the universe, do you ever feel alone as a person? Like you're the only person in the universe, or is that not something you're thinking about at the time?
No. To me, it feels like I am everyone, but they are also me.
And that doesn't bother you at all?
No. It's more of a profound spiritual feeling. I don't interpret it through that lens in quite the same way as most people, but to me, it's always yeah, like an overwhelming, sublime kind of state of mind.
Interesting. Okay. Huh.
Have you been through that yourself? States of non-dualistic unity.
I don't know about wait, yes. Only on my first big trip.
Oh, really?
So it's really hard to describe this, but because I'd heard it described that sometimes, well, I'll describe it and then you can tell me if you think it was or not, because I guess I don't know. I've only had 2 really big mushroom trips before, so I don't have like a whole bunch of experience at this level of like psychedelics, and this is my first one, so maybe my interpretation was offered different. But I remember saying something that I hear a lot of people say, like when you do psychedelics, you feel like you died. I don't think I ever had that feeling of feeling like I died, but I do remember that this was probably like hour 2 or 3 into my really big first one. The feeling was that it wasn't that I felt like I died. It felt like I was like floating through a void. And I distinctly had the impression that somebody that used to be called Stephen Bunnell a long time ago had died. But I was like fundamentally disconnected from that, whatever that was, or I recognized that was a thing that was a long time ago. And then there was just a feeling of kind of like floating in the void. Would have been my feeling for probably about hour 2 or 3 of that really big mushroom trip.
Yeah.
So does that sound more like a non-dualistic thing, or do you think that was just like something different, or?
To me, that just sounds like the more standard forms of ego death, where your sense of self disappears or reduces, as
Gotcha.
opposed to it.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, unity is almost the opposite of ego death, which is why I don't like them being lumped into the same phrase. But these phrases are colloquial slang at this point. If anything, it's your sense of self expanding, being applied to more things as opposed to less things.
Okay, definitely nothing like that ever. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's rather than your sense of identity disappearing, it's now being applied to systems and concepts that it was never applied to before, which makes you feel one with that thing.
Gotcha. No, never that before. No.
Okay. Yeah, it's a somewhat less common experience. I think if we figured out how to reliably induce it, it would be very, very powerful and beneficial. But it seems to be a difficult thing to figure out the what triggers it. I can't figure it out. I've been able to lead people into the state by sort of describing the general concept of an illusory nature of self and leading them to come to the conclusion independently. But it can't be done reliably.
Sure. Okay. Anybody else? As a neuroscience Andy, I'm curious how they study of your hallucinations. Do they believe those experienced under drugs are similar to those experienced through schizophrenia? The pathways are common debate here. I do research on the paraqueductal gray PAG and D1, D2 links to sensory disorders and behavior. Do you have any thoughts on that?
On whether hallucinations through schizophrenia are similar to hallucinations. I mean, I would say that there's probably some commonality between schizophrenic hallucinations and delirium hallucinations, and there's a little bit of commonality between them and psychedelic hallucinations, but there are so many other factors at play during a psychedelic experience that aren't that common during schizophrenia, as far as I can tell, that it ends up resulting in a completely different thing. One part of that would be how the hallucinations that people experience on psychedelics are often comprised of condensed psychedelic geometry, and that seems to be a specific thing that occurs during a specific brain state that is hard to induce outside of the psychedelic experience.
Gotcha.
So there's some commonality, but yeah, I think they have different causes.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, I think that's about all I can think of. If there's anything else that comes up, if you want to chat about anything, you can always send me a message. Yeah, what's up?
Okay, yeah. Can I plug my YouTube channel?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So my YouTube channel is Josiekins, Josiekins. I don't have that many subscribers, but I was trying to build up some videos. A bit of a following on the side. So yeah, if you could look that up, that would be cool. My website is effectindex.com, and that's about it, really.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, hey, if anything comes up, you want to chat again, yeah, just give me a shout. We can talk about whatever.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, you too. I'll talk to you
All
later.
right, have a good one.
Bye. Based drug users.